Well, ready? Here we go. Welcome to QBA's Toolbox Talks.
It's on now.
Friday. Hello, Mr. Clark, for Friday, the 7th of July. Welcome to everyone who's joined us live, and thank you to those who are watching this recording later on our YouTube channel. Today, I'm really excited. We've got Rob Stevens back in the chair again, and Rob's going to be taking us through a bit of a refresher, really, with regards to where we're currently sitting at the moment with regards to permitting, things like refresher on that record keeping, because that's a very strong element that I suppose is probably being picked up a little bit when people are coming through and asking for applications for permits to transport hives and equipment into Queensland. So we're going to run over that, and then Rob's kindly put together some material as well to support beekeepers who are thinking about migrating interstate and heading down to Victoria or working bees in New South Wales, and what they can expect and what they need to know about now to start pre-planning for that exercise. But first of all, I'd like to kick off by just giving everyone a slight intro into the QBA, because I think that's something that I've glared over in recent episodes. For those who aren't familiar, my name is Jo Martin, and I'm the State Secretary with the Queensland Beekeepers Association. My job directly is liaising with our executive board and also providing advocacy and representation at both the local government and state government level here in Queensland. And we support the national efforts of our national industry body, particularly with regards to things like the varroa incursion at the moment and all other elements that support a healthy and strong and very vibrant beekeeping sector in Queensland. The Queensland Beekeepers Association, interestingly, has been around for 137 years this year. So we have a very long and rich, very proud history of looking after the welfare and interest of our beekeepers in Queensland, looking after our members, but also more broadly the welfare of all beekeepers in Queensland. And to date, we're nearly at that 10,000 beekeeper mark and around about 160,000 hives registered in beekeeping. So we're certainly a sector on the move, and henceforth today we're going to cover what you need to know about moving your bees around. So to start off, I'd like to pay acknowledgement to the First Nations and traditional owners of the lands in which we all are coming from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to now hand over to our great and fantastic Rob Stevens, the manager of the Varroa Mite Prevention and Preparedness Program in Queensland. Rob, the show's yours.
Thanks, Jo. Hopefully that's coming across on your screens now. So
that looks great.
See if I can move this along. So hopefully everyone's been following this at home, but you should all know about the incursion down in New South Wales. Obviously, it started over a year ago now. Unfortunately, there has been a bit of movement in the last week or so. So we're up to 183 IPs in New South Wales now. And unfortunately, a few of those have been on the march. So they're definitely increasing around that central cluster and also around Newcastle. So we just got to keep watching the situation. New South Wales DPI is doing an amazing job, and we also really want to acknowledge the work that ARBIC's been doing and also the work that we've been doing with QBA. We couldn't do it without the support of industry. So they've got a big job ahead of them, but they're doing an amazing job down in New South Wales. So obviously, since the response happened in New South Wales, Queensland stood up its own preparedness program, and a big part of that preparedness program was managing ongoing permitting and compliance requirements for the movement of bees and bee carriers into Queensland. And we're also working with AgriScience Queensland as well in the event that things don't go to plan and we need to have a transition of management. But at the moment, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest varroa is in Queensland, and we plan to keep it that way. So just want to quickly touch on testing, and forgive me, I've sort of put these slides together this morning and it jumps over the place a little bit, but want to cover a few topics today about everything in relation to interstate movement. And the first thing that you guys need to understand is the level of testing is a little bit different to some of the testing we've been advocating for proof of freedom. So a lot of what we were doing with our autumn blitz was slightly different numbers, and that's because it's based on different mass. So if you're moving interstate and you need a permit, 64 is your magic number. So if you've got less than 64 hives, you're testing all of them. 64 to 640, you're still testing 64. And then above 640, you're testing 10%. So it's really important that you mark your hives hives, and also mark the hives that you've done the test of. So if you are doing subsequent testing for one of the other jurisdictions or before you come back, test a different round of hives than what you tested the first time around. That'll give a better degree of confidence that you are varroa free. So the big sticking point, and where some of the states are a little bit different, is in terms of your definition of what an apiary is. In Queensland, we've got it fairly black and white that if you've got a site more than 2 kilometres from another site, it is its own apiary, and it does need its own testing done on it. So again, this is different to the proof of freedom testing, where we were encouraging beekeepers to pick your own apiary site and you test your most at risk one. In terms of interstate movement, you need to test every site that is contributing to that consignment. So I know that is an extra burden, but we're still in a very poised position at the moment with New South Wales, and it's really, really important that we assess all the risk and we test every single site individually. So each site is considered its own location, and you do need to test those 64 hives from each. So you've also got a requirement, excuse me, to keep records. So it's not just about keeping your bees, you've got to keep accurate records on what you're doing. So that record doesn't have to be in a particular form. It can be whatever suits you. A lot of commercial beekeepers, you've got your apps, you've got your own spreadsheets. We don't want to change that. We just want to provide people with a fail-safe option if they need to, that we've provided a record book. You can also go online and you can do one-off copies of hive movement declarations as well. But basically, it's anything that's capturing that essential data, where the hives came from, how many, where they're going, where they've been. So you are required to keep these records for 2 years. And by doing that, you're fulfilling your general biosecurity obligation under the Act. So now when I say 2 years, that's just your normal record keeping requirement. When it comes to a biosecurity instrument permit or permitting, you do have some additional requirements there. So now, again, I mentioned about some some example ones that we provided. If anyone went to QBA conference last month, you would have received one of our record keeping books. We're planning on distributing those to all the branches of QBA. We'll also try and get some out to some of the affiliate branches in the future as well. So if anyone hasn't received one of those books and they would like one, just make contact and we'll get one in your hands. But it's just a nice, simple way for you to keep your records, basically. So, and yeah, if you keep your own record and you're keeping the same information, then you're ticking the box. That's all you have to do to fulfill your obligation. So under the biosecurity instrument permit, you have to keep records of your testing as well. So your alcohol wash testing, and that needs to be provided to authorised inspector upon request. So to do that, all you've got to do is submit it to B123, and that's our preferred way of receiving alcohol wash testing. You are required to keep records. If you're doing it any other way, you are required to keep them for 3 years. So you've got to have it readily accessible and legible for a authorised officer upon request. So, and this is why we need records. So this is the complexity of hive movements. This is just a small example in southeast Queensland, and it shows the interconnectedness of beekeepers that, you might be moving some hives around and not realising you're in close proximity to people that are moving more hives around. So all beekeepers do expose themselves to risk when they are moving hives around. So it's really, really important to track that risk and keep accurate records. So from our point of view, we want records going both ways. In the event that we get a high risk trace contact from New South Wales, we'll be tracing both forward and backwards. So we want to know where your hives came from and also where they've been in a particular time frame. So that's how our tracing works. And I think most people are familiar with this terminology post-COVID, that people understand the basics of how tracing works for pest and disease. So I won't bore you with too much there. So like I said, in terms of record keeping for your hive testing, you've just got to use the B123 form. Hopefully most people have seen this by now. If you haven't, scan the QR code. You can go on our eHub or our DAF website and you can get some information on that. You can also download the app, and that gives you the ability to enter data offline. If you have got beehives that are going into more remote locations, you can download the app, enter the data. As soon as you come back into service, it'll submit. So this gives you an extra option. Now, I understand a few people have been having a few issues with the app, and I suspect it's because there was a brief period where we actually changed QR code. So what I would encourage anyone that has suggested that they had an issue with the app, just rescan that QR code in it, and that'll make sure you've got the most up-to-date form. And I think that will solve most people's problems. But when in doubt, you can always just do the online form as well. If anyone is having particular trouble, ring our call center on 132523 and we will talk you through it. So we don't want people giving up and not submitting. We want to make sure we're aware if there are IT issues. If it's something that can't be overcome, ring the call center and we will manually enter the data for you. So really important. So when you do submit to B123, you'll actually be emailed a copy of your submission. So you can use that as you see fit. So we don't want to be sharing beekeeper data with other jurisdictions, but we give you the information so you can share it. So if you want to apply for interstate movement through another jurisdiction, and you submit your testing record to us, you'll receive a copy. You can then provide that copy to the other jurisdictions, say New South Wales, so more so Victoria or South Australia, for example, if you're going down to almonds. So you can also use that for evidence to, if you've got a pollination contract in Queensland and you want to prove to the orchard owner that you've done your due diligence, or if you're having a sale of hives and you want to prove that you've done testing on it. So that information is yours to use as you see fit. So the permit system was one of our main priorities when we've swapped into the preparedness program. So we've been working with movement control orders since about this time last year. Late June, early July is when the first movement control order went up, and we started issuing the first biosecurity instrument permits for the transfer of honey. So we quickly tried to make that a bit easier for retailers, and now there's no restrictions on the moving of processed honey. The next thing we did was allowing hives down to almond pollination last year. That should be significantly easier this year, we're hoping, and we're expecting more beekeepers might make that journey down to Victoria or South Australia. So we're part of what we call an interstate working group, where we're working with the other jurisdictions like South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, and we're trying to harmonise all our conditions. So we're trying to make it easy for beekeepers that you don't have to have too many different sets of rules. Unfortunately, there's always going to be some variation. So it is up to you to check with the jurisdiction you're dealing with to make sure that you are abiding by their regulation. And I'm going to provide you with some of that information today. But you just got to bear in mind, as we get closer to the almond season starting, some of these things might get tweaked at the last minute, and it is up to you to engage with those jurisdictions and stay up to date.
Yeah, entirely. I think that's probably something to definitely just to be very conscious of. Just as a general disclaimer, the information that Rob's going to be able to sort of take us through is very, very generalised at the moment, and we really are hoping that the other jurisdictions, Victoria and South Australia, will start landing on exactly what their conditions are going to look like. Victoria's already got their permit system up and going, so if you're thinking about going to Victoria, go back and watch episode 5, and Nikki Jones, who's the APRI manager for Biosecurity Biosecurity Victoria, gave us a great overview of the permit system in last week's Toolbox talk. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is very much point in time. This is right as of now, but be aware that some things might change, and they might change for the better. It might be less restrictive for you. So there is definitely a lot of communication going with all industries, but in particular the almond industry was greatly affected last year, and Victoria has done a lot of work with the almond board to make sure that we're facilitating the movement of hives, because we don't want the same scenario last year. So Queensland's in a similar position to Victoria, that we're hoping to lock in what we're calling a business continuity plan. So even in the event if there is another detection that's a bit of a curveball that's outside of the current zones, that we don't want to be pausing, having standstills like last year. We don't want there to be complete standstills of bee movement. We know that beekeepers need business continuity as well. They need the freedom to move hives, particularly if they're in low risk areas. So everything's based on risk for us. That's what we plan on put forward, that if you're in a low risk area, and this is why the proof of freedom data is so important too. And we keep asking people to submit your testing, because in the event that we do get a detection in Queensland, we need that data to support that not all Queensland is affected. We could have zones that are free to move, and this is the kind of thing we want to do moving forward. So we're hoping in the next week or two we'll have that finalised, and we'll share that a bit more broadly, what our continuity plan is and what restrictions we would be proposing to put in place in the event of certain scenarios. So as you know, a big reason for that is because of the situation that happened last year with Taree. I don't know if some of you remember, but there was an illegal movement of bees that led to the detection of varroa around the Taree region. The border shut for about I want to say 8 to 10 weeks. So
yeah, I think you were on the money mark there, Rob. Yeah.
And that was a lot longer than we thought, but that was just how complicated it was. We don't want that to happen again. If we get another Taree type situation, if we've got all the tracing in place, we think we should be able to just have a zone around that area, and the rest of what we call the blue zone in New South Wales should be free to continue business. So that's our plan moving forward, that we're not going to lock down whole states because of one additional detection somewhere. Again, it's all based on risk. So the application process for Queensland, that you go online to our DAF website, you fill out what we call a stage 1 application form. Now, this form is not very bee-centric. This is a fairly generic biosecurity instrument permit form, and it's used for animal industry, plant industries. It's across the board. So once you fill that out to the best that you can, as long as you've ticked apiary stuff in the first drop downs, it'll get to us. When it gets to us, we will contact you and we will send you what we call a stage 2 application, and that will have a lot more of the specifics. So we'll talk to each applicant about what their proposed movement is, and we'll make sure that they're given the information they need on their particular movement. So at the moment, you can move live bees from the New South Wales GZ. You can move equipment for irradiation. You can move supers back into Queensland. The honey doesn't need a permit anymore, but we've also just finalised some of it for queen bees as well. We're planning for queen bees to start moving freely again from the New South Wales blue zone as well. So we will communicate with each individual beekeeper. We'll make sure you understand your obligations. Once you fill out the secondary application form, our team will review it. They might come back to you with any additional questions we might have. We'll assess it. We'll say whether it's approved or not, and then you'll be given your permit, and you'll be given an information notice, and you'll be given the conditions of that permit. So I really want to reiterate that when you get issued your permit, it is your obligation to fulfill the conditions of that permit. It's not just once you've applied, you can go move your bees. There are conditions. Some of those conditions I'll talk about shortly, like you will have to have your pre-departure testing in place. You will have to prove to us that you've got your quarantine secure method of transport. So it's not just a tick and flick exercise. If beekeepers aren't proving that they're abiding by the permit, their permits will be cancelled and they won't be issued with subsequent permits. So you are breaching the Biosecurity Act if you're not abiding by the conditions of your permit. So when you fill out the stage 2 form, it's very much set out very similar to your B123. It's in that same format. So we send you a link. It'll look very similar. You fill out the form to you. We've tried to make it one form for everything. So some of the questions might always not make perfect sense to you, but we didn't want to have 6 different versions of the form. So it's a drop down, some of it you'll talk about what your varroa carrier is. Your carrier is live bees, it's supers, it's your queen bee. So it's the type of movement that you're planning to do. And the rest of it is really more about specifics. So it's about what dates you're proposing to go, what route you're trying to take, and your testing and things like that. So again, I really want to reiterate that you need to do that level of testing per apiary site that's part of that consignment. So I do fully understand that is a burden, but it's one that's required at the moment. So look, in the spirit of harmonisation between the states, that might get changed in the future. It might drop down back to 10%. Excuse me, but at the moment it's on 64. So we'll keep working with the other states on that. From what I'm hearing at the moment, South Australia is sticking with that. Victoria could well drop to 10%, but you can understand why. The sheer volume of hives that they're going to be dealing with going into their state, they just don't have the staff that they can assess all these things. So, yeah, but at the moment, yeah, we'll stick with 64, but we will definitely be communicating with industry if those figures change. So at the moment, we've had about 177 applications come through our system. Since the border reopened on the 21st of April, we've issued 77 permits. 39 of those have been for live bees from New South Wales. So we're looking at about 23,500 hives have come back into Queensland from New South Wales. But again, we're comfortable with that, where the risk is low. We've got the mitigation in place, and that's why it's really, really important that beekeepers follow the conditions of that permit.
Entirely. And probably just to add that there is a very robust compliance program that operates in the background of those permitting exercises at the moment. So, beekeepers should not assume that it's a, freedom to move into Queensland and, you're not going to have contact with anyone. It is very much a system that you should always expect the unexpected. So if if you're ticking all your boxes and doing the right thing, then there should be no concerns there.
Especially as we move into the pollination season, that we plan on doing spot checking, and we plan on doing follow-up surveillance at these mass pollination events too. So people are planning to do avocados and macadamias around Bundaberg after almonds. That's probably a good opportunity where we'll have a high volume of hives that we can do some testing on. So, yeah. So, yeah, you can see a lot of the permits too are New South Wales beekeepers being allowed access to what they used to do. They're from northern New South Wales, and they're moving equipment over the border for irradiation at Stereotech. So we want to facilitate that as well. It's very low risk because the end game is it gets treated. So it might not be an approved treatment for varroa, but I can tell you irradiation will kill varroa. So we're fairly comfortable with those permits going for radiation. Live bees was originally designed, and same with supers, the original intent was for Queensland beekeepers that were stuck in New South Wales to return to Queensland, but we've moved past that now. So it's more about giving beekeepers opportunity to have their business continuity again. So it's giving beekeepers the flexibility that they can choose to work in other states. They can do pollination jobs in other states again. We don't want to be unnecessarily restricting trade where we don't have to be. So that's the reason why. I know some people weren't comfortable and would like to see hard borders with New South Wales indefinitely, but we've got to move on with it. We've got to have a system in place that assesses the risk and allows beekeepers to have opportunity to trade. So, and that's what industry wants as well. That's what your peak industry body, ARBIC, wants. That's what has been advocated for between the jurisdictions, and that's why we have the interstate working groups, that we're trying to work with all the pollination reliant industries that need beekeepers, and they need that movement of beehives for business continuity.
And probably just to add to that as well, this is henceforth the reason why doing broad scale field surveillance is just so important as well. That if you consistently and regularly checking, doing your alcohol washes and your drone uncappings, and you've got that regular system of doing your surveillance, then at an absolute minimum, if you do see something that's a little bit suspicious, you've got that prior history effectively. That really, really does help. But, fundamentally, exotic mite surveillance, whether we're in response mode or out of response mode, it is something that all beekeepers should be doing to protect not only their own interests, but the welfare and interest of their mate up the road, or, the industry as a whole, I suppose. So it really brings home the need. If we've got movement of bees occurring, it really is in your best interest to be out there and checking that information and uploading that information to the internet. The B123 portal, the data that goes in there fundamentally also shows governments a reflection of industry's commitment towards protecting its future. I think that's probably the biggest point that I want to make clear to everyone. By putting your data in, it's giving the governments a level of data to show that people are really, really passionate about sourcing data to help give evidence that we're in this for the long run, and this is an important fight for all of us.
And it's an important part of the response plan too. We need that uptake of compliance, we need that buy-in from industry. If we can demonstrate that industry is committed, it helps us get funding, it helps us get resources, it helps us plead our case for freedom.
And it makes the QBA's job an awful lot easier when we want to see more biosecurity officers and we want to see more improved programs and better resourcing for industry.
So I'm sure you're all sick of me getting up here and talking about B123, but we're just going to keep on pushing it because we need these numbers, and without it, and especially if things go wrong in New South Wales, if we want to live with varroa, Queensland's got a real opportunity. It doesn't mean just because of New South Wales waves the white flag that it's endemic in all of Australia. We could keep it out of Queensland for 6 months, 6 years, a decade. It could be kept out indefinitely if beekeepers are vigilant and do their part. So,
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, it only needs one person to do the wrong thing, and the whole system can fail. So, yeah. I mentioned before, we'll communicate with beekeepers in the permit process. We've just recently had a bit of a review of our permit process, and we give the permit conditions as part of your permit approval process, but we've sort of seen that some beekeepers are getting a little bit confused. So we want to make sure that early on in the process, beekeepers know exactly what they're signing on for, because you've got a checklist of things that you need to deliver when you've applied for to abide by the conditions of your permit, and we've tried to make that easy. So we've given you a little checklist sheet, so you can just tick these. Some other requirements are pre-movement, some of them are during movement, and some of them are post-arrival. So if you just work down the list that we give you and you tick each of these things, and they're very easy things to achieve, and then we've just sort of aligned that to what condition number of your permit that is. So unfortunately, permits are written in a very legal terminology, so we've tried to make this really plain language for people as well, and give just a straight checklist that people can say, yep, I've done this, this, and this. I've fulfilled all the obligations in my permit. So we'll be making sure people get that at every stage of the permit application, so they know exactly what is going to be required before they do that movement. So one thing I've talked to QBA about, and I know there's a little bit of discontent and people are a bit thirsty for a bit more information on, is the movement of supers back into Queensland. Now, again, we've sort of outgrown the original intent of this process. That this permit was originally designed before the New South Wales GEZ or the Blue Zone was considered free. So this allowed beekeepers that were stuck in New South Wales to repatriate their supers, and they could get them extracted into Queensland. That was before the live bees were allowed to come across. So now you're freely allowed to move your live bees across. But what we're finding is we're getting more New South Wales people are actually wanting to move empty supers up to Queensland, whereas when it was Queensland applicants, it was full supers going back to Queensland for extraction. Now it's New South Wales beekeepers that have already moved to Queensland. They're sending their supers down for extraction, and they want to send empty supers back up. So it is something we're aware of, and we plan to do a little bit more review. It is what it is at the moment, and some of the conditions are a bit laborious and don't make a lot of sense, but you've got to look at it with that lens that this was designed before live bees were originally allowed to go interstate. Unfortunately, there is an extra complication too, though, that people are moving the supers without the live bees, and sometimes those empty supers in New South Wales might have been off bees for several months. So it's no good saying you've done an alcohol wash of these hives, because that's not relevant anymore. So there is a little bit of extra, and I'll move forward and back here, there is an extra requirement that you need to have a withholding period. So when you return those hives to Queensland, if you've got access to a cold room, you can put them in there at -15 for 24 hours. And then if you just keep them in a quarantine secure manner for 7 days, they're good to go. Now, if you don't have access to a cold room, you can keep them quarantine secure for 14 days, and then you can have access to them. So now the same rules basically apply if they're full supers or if they're empty supers. But just before, I should just reiterate, before you get to that step, you've got some requirements that you've got to move, that you've got to be visibly free of mites. They've got to be stored in quarantine secure manner, which just I think people get a bit hung up on this as well. We don't want to be too prescriptive with this. We don't want to get to the point where we have to tell people you have to wrap it in shrink wrap 3 times and you have to have this many straps on it or anything like that. We just want it to be bee proof to the best of your ability, and that's why we've kept it fairly simple terminology in terms of quarantine secure. It just means no ingress or egress for bees, basically. So we do ask as part of that permit process, though, that you do send a photo of your bees once they are ready for transport, so we can have a visual representation of how those bees were transited, so in case there is any follow-up issues. So we do realise that this is still causing a few issues with some beekeepers, that having that withholding period is causing issues. We're open to other plans, other options there, but it's not the same as live bees. We just can't do a simple alcohol wash. It's different. So we've got to have that withholding period at the other end, if that makes sense. But it is something we're going to review. We're going to work with our risk assessment, our scientific analysis team, and if we can come up with better ways, or if this, look, maybe some of those times could get shortened now. Again, you've got to look at it through the lens that this was before the GEZ was considered free. So things have moved on a little bit, so we might be able to reassess the length of time. So, yep. I'll a bit more into Queensland. So I think we've touched on this. Everyone should know Queensland is in itself a biosecurity zone. So you need a permit to move bees into the biosecurity zone if it's coming from a state that has varroa. So that is only New South Wales at this point. So at the moment, and I think this is where a lot of beekeepers are confused, you do not need a permit to return bees from a state that doesn't have varroa. So if you're returning from almond pollination from Victoria or South Australia and you're just transiting through, and we'll go into transiting in a moment, you don't need a permit from us. So a lot of people have been waiting for Queensland and thinking that we're going to have these harsh permit requirements. You don't need one. You're good to go. You need a permit to get to almonds. You don't need a permit to come back. So
on the provisos, you're returning straight home from almonds.
And we'll go into that. So again, you've got to be registered. You've got to have your BIP in place to exit the state. If you are coming from, so I've talked about this with some people this week. Some beekeepers might change their business plan this year, that they might want to return via New South Wales and actually take up the opportunity to do a pollination job there. In that instance, you will need a permit. If you're doing more than transiting, if you're stopping for more than 48 hours in New South Wales, you need a permit. But the permit's going to be very simple. It's not, especially if you're in an area of Western New South Wales, it's going to be the same as what you already would have done to get out. You would have just had to have your testing up to date, and transit the bees in a quarantine secure manner. It's going to be that easy. But we do realise it's I don't know if most or not, but if you're just planning on transiting through, you don't actually need a permit from us. If you are planning to stay in New South Wales and do other pollination work or honey production, then you'll just need to apply for a permit. So, and again, I mentioned before, if you don't follow the conditions of these permits, you are breaching legislation and you're liable for up to 2,000 penalty units or a year in prison. So people need to understand that it's not a tick and flick exercise. Once you get issued a permit, you're good to do whatever you want. If we're doing compliance checks and we pick up non-conformance, there will be consequences, because our job is to protect the Queensland industry. We do not want this mite coming in. They've got a huge battle on their hands in New South Wales. They're on the cusp of what way that's going to go. So we do not plan to jeopardise the biosecurity of the Queensland bee industry. And I can't stress enough how important it is, if you apply for a permit, that you adhere to every condition of that permit. So but yep, if you're coming, I've already mentioned this, but if you're coming from states that don't have it, you don't need a permit at the moment. So you're not actually waiting for Queensland to settle on something. It's more so the other states. And like I said, we'll work that we're harmonised in terms of testing with the other states, but we don't intend on changing that. You're not going to need a permit. And the reason for that is that we moved away from emergency provisions and emergency legislation. And that's the way our legislation works. So I mentioned the movement control orders. you're only allowed to have a movement control order in place for 3 months, and then you should only repeat that process once or twice. So movement control orders and emergency provisions under the Biosecurity Act are temporary. They're not meant to be long-term arrangements. And that's what part of our job was, how to transition from a temporary emergency situation to more long-term legislation. So that's why Queensland has turned into a biosecurity zone, and it future-proofs it. So if there is a detection in another state, it's exactly, we don't have to change anything. So we haven't worded our legislation that you need a permit from New South Wales. It's come from a state that has varroa. So if there are detections from other states, which might happen in the future, we don't have to change our legislation. Whereas all these other states working under emergency provisions, every time there's a new detection, they have to go back to square one and rewrite the whole process and rezone everything. So we've already moved away from those emergency provisions, and that's why you don't need a permit to come from those states that don't have varroa. If that makes sense to everyone. I mentioned the transiting requirements. So we've just got some confirmation from New South Wales on this, that it's very similar conditions to last year. But last year you needed there was a group permit that was issued. This time you won't actually have to have a permit. You will have to have your prerequisites in order though. So if you're doing anything in New South Wales, you have to have done, I'll go on this slide first. So you have to have done your TOCAL training online. And bear in mind, I didn't notice this till I looked at it today, that it's got to be done in 12 months. Myself,
Yes.
I did this last July, so my 12 months is nearly up. So
Mine
there
as
might be
well,
some
Rob.
other, if there's any beekeepers that did do the testing early in the game last year, just make sure you were aware of that. You are due to redo your training. I only realised this today. I didn't realise it had a 12-month validity on it. So anyone that did do it last year, I'm sure some of you will be expiring in July, August. So make sure you get back online and do the test again, do the training again, I should say.
And for those who are looking for the link, I'm popping it in the chat right now so you can go online and start initiating that.
And it's fairly simple. And to be honest, even if you're not planning on moving hives, it's a really great little varroa awareness course. Last time I did it, it only takes, look, I probably skimmed it a little. I did it in probably half an hour, if that. But I think it's only designed to take less than an hour, and it gives you a good understanding of what is required for moving beehives and just the risk of varroa and testing. So I believe they've updated it too with they've made some new videos on sugar alcohol washing and things like that. So I will probably redo the training myself and see where it's at. So it looks like some other states are actually advocating that same TOCAL training. I believe South Australia has put that forward, and it makes sense. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to go make our own course. New South Wales is a combat agency. We don't need to complicate things. They've got the training in order. We're happy for you to do that. We don't require you to do that, but other states might. So like I said, if you're planning to go into South Australia, I believe they need you to do the TOCAL training as well. And you've got to have your testing up to date. So any movement through New South Wales, you've got to have done your 16-week testing.
Absolutely.
That's done at a different threshold to our testing, because I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but 26 is your magic number there as opposed to 64. But that is only for your 16-week testing. That is different to your permit testing. So if you're going to anywhere that requires a permit, you're going to need higher level of testing anyway. So,
and if you probably the easiest thing to get your head across is if you're moving through those different jurisdictions, if you're meeting the Queensland threshold, you're going to meet the other thresholds ultimately.
Rather than have to do 2 lots of testing, take the higher threshold and then don't double dip, don't have to do it again.
Blanket through that. I might just add to, Rob, just really quickly, that TOCAL varroa training, that is a prerequisite for entry into Victoria. So if you are planning to go to almonds, absolutely get online and get that course done and get your certificate sorted out straight away, because that is one of the prerequisites for your entry application into Victoria with that permit system. And if you haven't done that, your application will stall straight away. But their system's very much similar to ours, that you can start staging your permit application and doing little nuggets at a time until you can complete all of your information.
And make sure it doesn't expire while you're down there. So
yes.
But you've got to do hive movement declaration. And this was a bit of the sticking point, that this was a bit of an issue for New South Wales when that Taree episode happened, that the hive movement declaration system was a little bit too automated for a while, and now it's got triggers inbuilt. So if you put your destination is outside of New South Wales, or your origin is from a red zone or a purple zone, it's going to throw up flags straight away. So normally, if they get a destination in Queensland, they would require a permit from Queensland before they'll give the tick for the hive movement. But what they've done is they've got a system in place where they will see the dates that this is a transiting only application, and they're not going to be waiting on Queensland to supply a permit, because, like I said, we don't intend on issuing a permit if you're just transiting through. So that's we might have a few things to work out with New South Wales. It might not. The first couple will probably be the hardest, because it will flag straight away if you put your destination as Queensland. But again, we're hoping that it's capturing enough information that they can clearly see that's a transiting declaration. They're not going to need to wait on Queensland to provide any additional data. So mentioned before, there's not meant to be any stopping unless you've got an emergency. You can stop for up to 48 hours, but really you want to keep moving through as fast as possible. So something I will note, and it probably doesn't affect anyone in this that we're going to be talking to, but New South Wales for transiting does specifically mention commercial beekeepers. So we don't make any differentiation in any of our permitting between recreational, commercial, but in terms of their transiting requirements under their emergency orders, it specifically talks about commercial beekeepers are allowed to transit. So I don't really know what would happen if someone was moving from Queensland to Victoria and needed to transit through. I'm sure arrangements could be made, but in terms of the standard clauses in the transiting requirements, it is specifically designed for commercial beekeepers. So you can't have been, this is another sticking point, you can't have been in an emergency zone. Now every state is different, but most of them default straight back to January 2021. Now that's because that is thought to be the longest possible date that the incursion happened. So when it was discovered in June 2022, it was thought it could have been here 18 months. So that's the arbitrary date that you go back to, January 2021. But really your tracing is going to come into that, because if you get a new zone pop up and it was because of a direct movement, you don't want to restrict people that were there 2 years ago. So Queensland has been working a bit on this, that we want to have a more realistic time frame. We think 2 testing cycles. But there's a lot of scenarios there and how that can play out. But I don't think we can keep reverting back to 1 January 2021 indefinitely as the zones keep on getting bigger, because it's just, if there's no tracing going back that far, the zones are going to get bigger, and more beekeepers are going to be tied up in this. That you've got to say you've never been in that area in 3 years. You've got to go back through all your records, and you've got to keep good, accurate records of where you've been. And if those zones have shifted, you could inadvertently be declaring something that's false. So that's why we want to make that a little bit more realistic. But at the moment, you've got to watch this space, that every state might have something different there, but you definitely can't transit through the zone. And again, you shouldn't stop for more than 48 hours. So you've got to fulfill your hive movement declaration, jump on the New South Wales link there. And apparently there, you've got to keep your record for 5 years. And this is something that since they've invested a bit more money in the compliance down there, if you do not have a copy of your hive movement on you, you will get a penalty infringement notice. And I believe it's for $2,000.
Yes, it is in excess of $2,000, and there have been multiple offences and
there's been dozens
infringement notices handed out. So if you're crossing over that border, you need to make sure that your paperwork is Mickey Mouse, just like in COVID. Have everything with you.
Now that includes an electronic copy, so it doesn't have to be like you printed it out, but you need to be able to produce it. So don't be fighting with your phone and not being able to find it. If you've got it, it needs to be saved on your phone and being able to produce to an authorised officer, or $2,000 fine. So they're not messing around with this anymore. Penalty infringement notices, they just dish them out. So if you don't have the appropriate paperwork, you'll be getting a fine. So
And probably to add to that, with transiting through New South Wales, Narrabri is an absolute no-go zone. Do not go through Narrabri. To be very, very clear with you, there are RTA down there. There are New South Wales Police as well, and they will be intercepting. They know what B trucks look like. They know what equipment to look for. So ensure, if you are departing and you're planning to go down south through Gundy, for example's sake, head west. As soon as you get to Moree, start going west straight away. But yeah, Narrabri is definitely a no-go zone, particularly if you picked
Which highway?
up.
Is that the Newell? I want to say the Newell Highway, or I forget what it
yeah.
is, but yeah, it is a major transport route, unfortunately, but you're just going to have to go west. I also wouldn't recommend people go directly up the coast from
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Yeah, because you've got Nana Glen as
all of
well.
that
So your
area.
safest route is Western Queensland. So yeah. Now that's going to change in the future, because I don't want to get too bogged down in the response plan, but those outlying areas, they've actually got less periods. So I did mention the default 1 January. They've actually got, you can look it up in the emergency order for New South Wales, but they've got less restricted because they know when the risk was introduced to those areas. So they're going to go back to blue zone, hopefully by 2025. That's sort of the plan, that those outlying areas will come back into the blue. And that's the plan with the whole response, that these areas will shift from red zones to purple zones back to blue zones. And it's a 3-year response plan. So, but yeah. I think we covered the rest of New South Wales. Victoria, I was looking at their website today and they've been updating a little bit of their info. We've been having some regular conversations with Victoria, and a few things have changed on a fairly regular basis. So again, just take this with a grain of salt. Make sure you're consulting with the Victorian website close to the time of your movement. But it's all pretty similar. Like I said, they definitely do stick with the 1 January 2021. And then the rest of it's very similar to us. You've got to have your hive movement. You've got to have a health certificate as well for almond pollination anyway. So you've got to have done, this was even before varroa, you have to do AFB testing to go down to Victoria. So you actually need to get a health certificate from us before you apply for a permit from them. So that shouldn't be news to anyone that's gone through the the Victorian almond pollination before. So that's not new at all. So again, consult with the website closer to the time. So South Australia is still dragging the chain a little bit. So they're yet to reopen the border. But from what I understand, they're pretty much good to go. They're just tweaking some of they've got the draft gazetted notice ready to go. It should go ahead sometime soon. They've been already talking with almond industry, and some orchards are sort of already throwing dates up. I heard yesterday of the 25th of July. So that is 4 weeks away, if that. So I would be expecting that South Australia would be reopening the border within a fortnight, or they're going to be really struggling. So so some states might soften the restrictions a little bit, and this is because of what happened last year. We want to ensure there is free movement of hives. Like I said, we're anticipating that Victoria, because of the sheer numbers, might have to open up the. So with us, for example, if you've doing an alcohol wash test, it's valid for 2 weeks. You've got to have done it within 2 weeks of your transit. Victoria is thinking of pushing that out to 28 days. So that's going to allow a bit of flexibility that beekeepers can test. And then if the flowering comes on early, I think the flowering was all late last year. This year, if there is any early flowering, you want to make sure that some people are ready to go. So they need to expand that testing window a little bit, because you don't want to have thousands of hives needing testing a week before going. So, and that's why they're also thinking of dropping it to 10%, because it's the sheer numbers that have to get down there. And beekeepers, look, we know there's a burden. Testing 64 hives isn't easy. And for some of these guys that have got 10 loads of bees, it's a lot easier to check 12 hives than 64 per load. So they've got to find that happy medium. Again, we don't require anything coming back. So it's also expected, similar to last year, that hives coming from Queensland will be grouped in little geographical pockets together. Bubbles. Sorry, we don't want exposure to risks that's unnecessary. So if we can keep Queensland hives together, no offence to New South Wales, but no one wants to be put next to New South Wales hives down there. We want to be put next to other Queensland hives, similar risk. So look, there's going to be some exceptions. Some big orchards might have to have hives from multiple jurisdictions. But in general, that's the way they're going to try and go ahead, that Queensland hives will stay with Queensland hives, and then you're not exposing yourself to additional risk. So
best tip there, have a conversation with your broker or your growers.
Yeah. This was just a little checklist we made. Yeah, what you said was right, Joe, that Victoria does have the TOCAL training. We found that out today. I probably needed to update column 1 a bit more, because that testing ratio will be different per state, but you've got to do alcohol wash testing. You've got to have the TOCAL requirement. You've got to have quarantine secure. And it's Victoria in particular that's thinking about changing to 10%. South Australia was talking about it, but from our interstate working group yesterday, I suspect they're going to stick with 64. I think they probably will change the validity of the test, though. I think they'll drag it out. Probably not default. I think on case-by-case basis, 2 weeks. If you need extended, there'll probably be a little bit of play there. But yeah, for us, it's still 2 weeks. But that's probably about it. Any questions?
So please come forward with your questions. This is an open forum. Toolbox Talks. If you have got a question, anything at all, please feel free to put it out there in the world. Just feel free to unmute yourself, and yeah, otherwise raise your hand if you want to. I'm watching for everyone. It's always a handy one. 13 25 23 is your phone number, your magic number.
If you want to have a chat to us individually, have a chat to our permits officer as well, have a chat to myself, call the call centre. They'll put you in contact with our team. Email info@DAF. Yeah, if you've worked through the permitting system before, you've had the permit address. We're open to conversations. We might not. We'll tell you the information as of now. It's point in time. I don't think too much of what I said today won't be the case in 2 weeks' time. But if anything, things are getting easier, not harder for beekeepers. But again, we've got to closely watch the New South Wales situation. That if containment gets, if there's any big surprises there, again, we want to have our business continuity plans in place, that even if there is an unwarranted an unlikely detection, we don't want to be shutting the borders again. We want to have that continuity where beekeepers can be moving hives, all based on risk.
It's a big headache for everyone when these things happen. Paul, you've got a question for us.
Yes, I have. Very good to see you, Rob, and see this information that you've given to us. What my question specifically about is bee movement record keeping, and how many, like, I'm rearing queens. I've got nuke yards in relatively close proximity to each other. So if I'm shifting nukes between nuke yards, what is the threshold of what needs to be logged down, and the frequency thereof?
It's a tricky one. Like, we don't want to be too prescriptive with you. Like I said before, that 2K for us is that sort of magic number where we differentiate an apiary site. But again, if you've got yards that are on the same property, we're not really like, there's some other boundaries. Like, it's a bit arbitrary in that sense, that if you're on the same property or the same road, there's probably a little bit of flexibility there. Like, if you're doing your due diligence and you're doing your best to track the movements off site, then that's probably one thing. But again, we'd like to see in a perfect world that if you're moving more than a couple of kilometres, you are recording that movement. But we understand there's going to be some practicalities of it. We don't want you to be filling your record book in 2 months if you're doing that many movements. So look, and I should sort of reiterate as well that there's no obligation that you have to show us these records. You just have to keep the record. The only reason we're ever going to come knocking on your door to look at a record is because there is a risk and there is an emergency situation, that there has been a trace forward or there has been a detection in your vicinity. This isn't something where we're going to be making sure every beekeeper is checking records and waving a stick at anyone. The only reason we'll be checking your record is in your best interest if there's an emergency or if there's tracing information. So you've just got to think in terms of your business, what records, what movements do you need to record what are the at-risk movements, and if you needed to trace, look, if you're just moving between sites that are in close geographical proximity, that's probably low risk. If you're selling queens, you need to record that, obviously, because we need to know. So yeah, the book Joe's holding, we try to cover for a little bit of that. We've got different sections of the book, and we did put sales there as a separate sort of template to some of the other bee movement. We put a bit of generic information in there as well. I'm not sure if that really answers the question or not, Paul, because it's not black and white is the answer. That it's got to be you've got to look at it through the lens of your own business and what risk there is, and where if there was a trace forward to your property, what are the movements you think would need to be disclosed?
That's it. And record keeping 101, it's actually a part of every beekeeper's obligation. So I don't think it's ever been really brought home effectively and in very, communicated effectively. But it is within the legislation, every beekeeper's got a requirement to make sure that they are keeping those records. So hence, we did a bit of work with the varroa mite prevention and preparedness team. And, from last year's funding, we secured the production of these. So hopefully this will be a legacy item, as Rob and I commonly refer to, and it is designed ultimately for you guys to chuck it into your glove boxes in your ute, have it in your truck, wherever necessary. Heck, it's got a plastic insert on the outside of it. You could probably throw it in your lunchbox if you needed to, but this is designed for you to take those quick records in the field. If you're using a more complicated system, or you're doing some data entry back at the office, by all means, use this as your in between. So stuff that you might miss the gaps in here, this is a really, really great and effective way of doing that, and it's in a nice little size as well. But yeah, we've got a very sizable supply of these, so they're going to be distributed equally at our face-to-face board meeting that's happening Monday week following at the moment, and our branch representatives will make sure that they get them back to the branch meetings absolutely Mickey Mouse and very, very quickly. The Warwick guys, hopefully you should be having yours and getting your collection in time for your meeting next weekend, but please make sure that you utilise these. These are a really, really great resource, and we've put a lot of effort into putting them together as a very fast, quick field guide and a reporting guide.
Basically, something is better than nothing, because we know a lot of beekeepers have their apps. We don't want to reinvent the wheel for you, but some beekeepers just keep it upstairs, and that's not good enough. In post-varroa, you need to have some stuff documented. If we get a tracing into Queensland, we need to be able to get onto it as quickly as possible, and that's how we're going to protect the industry.
Absolutely. Can I open the floor? We've got a few people on the meeting. There must be some questions. I can see some names in there that I know that have a lot of appetite to travel interstate. Is there any questions at all? This is a great forum. We hope to keep this open and relaxed and casual, like we're having a catch up at the, post QBA conference, shall we say?
Well, hopefully that means that people are fairly confident that it's not going to be as bad as last year. We'd encourage people to consider doing the movements this year. Look, we think the risk is low, especially for transiting through. We're going to keep on working on our New South Wales Blue Zone stuff, and we think we need to refine that a little bit, in particularly with the supers and stuff like that. But in terms of almond pollination, look, if there's a detection down there, it's going to be really unfortunate, but look, we think we've got mechanisms in place where it's not going to be the end for everything.
Yeah.
Victoria's got contingency plans in place for if there are detections in almond pollination. There's all sorts of planning going on. So it's not easy, and unfortunately it's not always black and white, but yeah, some stuff is always going to be case by case, and that's what you'll see if you do apply for a permit. You'll be individually case managed by our staff. We're not being inundated with permits. We've got the time that we can talk you through. So if you've got any questions, by all means, give us a call, go through that, at least that stage 1 application. You don't have to follow through. You can put that stage 1 in, you start the conversation with us, and you can decide if you want to go ahead with going down to almonds. So just don't leave it to the last minute. So
absolutely, and probably, did a word of advice there as well. I think at this point in time, we're now at the end of the first week in July, and I've had an increasing number of phone calls about going into South Australia in this past week. You need to be assessing, I suppose, that risk, and that knowledge that South Australia haven't released their permit conditions at all at the moment. For your business to plan moving forward, pardon the pun, but I would be making sure that you've got a plan B up your schedule. You've got something else there that you can relate to, because I do know that there's very handsome sums of money that are being dished out to head towards South Australia. But if the provisions aren't there at the moment really clear for everyone, it does make pre-departure planning very, very difficult. And I know a lot of people have even expressed great frustration that that they may be as little as 3.5-4 weeks off of leaving to go down there. And given that the pollination period last year was really about 2 weeks, it was a very, very tight time frame to get everything done. But if you've got anything that you need support or guidance on, I'm always here. Shoot me an email. You can get me through the info at QBAB's box or the State Secretary email folder. So if you can't, you don't want to use the email, just send me a text message. It's probably the easiest way. I am constantly busy with talking with BQ. We're talking with GrowCom, with Queensland farmers. There's a lot of conversations always going on at the moment. We still have the Nature Conservation Act legislation looming over our heads as well at the moment. So there's a huge body of work that needs to be done there. But just make contact with me, and I will make sure that you've got the provisions to get in contact with Rob or Dean, anyone at the team who can help point you in the right direction. So but yeah, I might just call out for questions one more time. Does anyone
I'll just say one last thing on South Australia. We have got confirmation off them. One thing that they made particularly hard last year was that alcohol washers had to go through a lab. Now they've loosened that, and it'll be like the other jurisdictions, that it will be a self-assessment by beekeepers. So we have confirmed that from South Australia. And look, I don't think it's going to be very different to what the other states have proposed. There might be some slightly different wording, but basically Victoria and South Australia will be very, very closely aligned with what they're requesting. So I don't think you're going to get any surprises. It's more just a matter of them going through the motions and setting a start date of when they're going to start accepting applications. But I don't think there's going to be any curveballs in there, additional requirements that you're going to need. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. No other questions? It's a Friday afternoon. It's getting cool. I'm wondering what's everyone's going to have for dinner tonight, because I haven't planned anything at all yet. So typical Joe Martin, probably be pulling frozen pumpkin soup out of the freezer. But no, look, I might just call it a day there if we don't have any questions from the floor. Rob, my sincere thanks again. You guys are doing a stellar effort, and you're always available and at arm's length to us. And there are robust conversations that do occur, and I want to give my full my full onus to our members. We do hold the department accountable, but the teamwork that goes on is absolutely brilliant behind the scenes. And every time I've come forward to them with a proposition or a program proposal, it's always been considered, and 9 times out of 10 it's been rolled out. So I'm very, very thankful for that. But yeah, otherwise we will call it a day there. Go the Broncos, shall I say, maybe this weekend. I'm not really sure there. So, but yeah, State of Origin's coming up. So apologise if we've got any New South Wales beekeepers on here. Go the Maroons. Anyway, we'll wrap it there. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend, a safe weekend, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.